to Smith. Jabari for three and the win. Yeah! He got it!
And they're powered by their all-star center, Akeem Olajuwon. But ask the Rockets who gives them the right stuff, and they'll say Otis Thorpe.
Adds muscle, speed.
Otis going to take it inside and jams it over the Admiral.
Aggressive.
Maxwell in the middle to Thorpe. Oh! Thorpe went 10 feet in the air to slam that rascal home.
He's got some big hands, and he gets going down the middle and puts that baby over his head, and he can just throw it down on anybody.
Somebody better turn around or he's going to take it all the way.
Well, one guy on the team, Dave Jamison, right now, he said the way I handle the ball, he just thinks about a Nerf ball.
Rebound Thorpe. He palms the ball. Looks like it's a ping pong ball the size of his massive right hand.
Well, there's some debate over the size of Thorpe's hands. There's no question about his ability to use them under the basket.
Look at Otis Thorpe. Oh, my goodness. Drives it in, lays it up, misses. Otis Thorpe is right there and slams it home.
I think a good rebound is someone who's willing to sacrifice their body. There's nothing a coach can really teach you but to box out. But at the same time, you got to go after the ball and have an idea of where that ball's coming off the rim at.
Otis Thorpe. His blue-collar style is proven to be a perfect complement to his more flamboyant teammates.
We are here to Fuel Rockets News. This is Rockets Fuel Podcast presented by the Believe Network. Of course, I'm your host, Ashar Binkley. You can always find me on Twitter at Binkley Hoops. I am a credential writer covering the Houston Rockets and Rio Grande Valley Vipers. You can always find my written work over at SB Nation or The Dream Shake. And of course, we want to talk about today's sponsor, our new sponsor, that is Bet Online. Bet Online is your number one source for all your summer sports this season, from MLB, golf, NBA, and NHL playoff stats. All the latest stats, news, and scores available to follow your favorite teams. Get the latest odds and lines, including the latest team matchups, player props, and odds on just about every sport out there. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to get in on the action. Bet Online, where the game starts. And today is a very special show because this is the first Rockets Rewind episode. And with Rockets Rewind, what I want to do is be able to bridge the gap between older fans and newer fans, older fans that were around when the Rockets won their only 2 championships, and the newer fans, a lot of them that weren't even born in the 90s when the Rockets actually won their last championship. And with this series, I want to talk about players that may not have been talked about enough. They don't get enough recognition. They're sometimes overlooked. Of course, you know about players like Akeem Olajuwon and Vernon Maxwell, but do you know about players like Carl Herrera, Scotty Brooks, even a Charles Jones, players that you may not ever even heard of, but without those players, the Rockets probably wouldn't have any championships at all, even as great as Akeem Olajuwon was, and players like Vernon Maxwell and Robert Horry and Sam Cassell and Mario Elie, names that you absolutely, know to this day. But with this series, I want to be able to talk to the younger fans and let them know that, hey, these are players that you should know and that you should recognize. And they may not have highlight tapes like some of the other players or highlight videos. See how old I am. I'm saying highlight tapes, but they are players that without their contribution, we would not see any banners up in the Toyota Center. And even with the older fans, it's kind of a going back down memory lane and bringing back some of those great memories that we all had from the 90s when the Rockets were winning this championship. And the first player I want to talk about today was Otis Thorpe, OT. And Otis Thorpe is one of my favorite players of all time. And one of the reasons why he's one of my favorite players, because yes, he didn't have the flashy plays. He didn't have the flashy stats. You're not going to go back and look at his basketball reference page and be like, wow, he averaged 25 points and 10 rebounds in a season. That's not Otis Thorpe. And you also have to remember, back in that day, in the 90s, there wasn't a lot of high scoring games like there are now, even when there were back in the early 80s. It was about toughness, about physicality. And without Otis Thorpe contribution and being one of the most physical players in the league, we wouldn't have a championship in 1994 for the Houston Rockets. Otis Thorpe was one of the main reasons why the Rockets were able to win that championship that season, because his ability to be able to be one of the best outlet passers in the entire NBA. He was a tenacious rebounder. He was a true Iron Man that rarely missed games. Thorpe may not be the first name you think of when you talk about Houston Rockets legends, but he should be mentioned a lot more because, like I said, without Otis Thorpe, we may still be waiting for the Rockets to win their first championship, and that cannot be said enough, and that's why I want to talk about him first in my Rockets Rewind series. Otis Thorpe was part of the best draft class in NBA history, if not the best, the 1984 draft class. The star-studded draft, of course, gave us the Rockets' best player in franchise history and future teammate of Otis Thorpe, Akeem Olajuwon, at the time known as Akeem. It also included Charles Barkley, John Stockton, and some player named Michael Jordan, who I'm sure you've heard of a few times over the years. Even in that stacked draft, Thorpe would go number 9 overall to the then Kansas City Chiefs after making first-team All-Big East in his senior year and averaging 14.4 points and 8 rebounds in his final year in college. You did hear that right, the Kansas City Kings, because at the time, they played in Kansas City. They started off in Cincinnati, and of course, now we know them as the Sacramento Kings. Thorpe would only play 1 year in Kansas City before they moved to Sacramento. In his rookie year, he averaged almost 13 points and almost 7 rebounds a game in his rookie season. After that 1987-88 season, after a few seasons playing with the Kings, where they pretty much didn't go anywhere, the Kings decided to move on and trade him to the Houston Rockets for Rodney McRae, who was a top 5 pick for the Rockets back in the early 80s, and Jim Peterson, a backup center that played for the Rockets for several seasons. That move would not only change Otis Thorpe's career, but it would also change the trajectory of the Houston Rockets franchise, which at that point, I don't know how big of a trade the Rockets knew that would turn out to be for them. After being traded to the Rockets, unfortunately, the Rockets' overall results pretty much played out how they had the past several seasons. The Rockets made the finals in 1986, but after that, they were kind of stuck in mud after losing to the Boston Celtics in that 1986 finals. The Rockets did not get back to the conference finals from 1986 until finally in 1994, which we'll get to in a little bit. But even though the Rockets did kind of stay in the same place that they were for the last several years, even after the Otis Thorpe trade, the trade did start to bear fruit in the 1991-92 season. Thorpe had his best season up to that point as he became an all-star for the first time. There was also another significant event right around the corner for the Rockets, another event that would also change kind of trajectory, change the course of the Rockets going forward into the 90s. Don Chaney had been a Rockets head coach since Otis Thorpe was traded to Houston and even won Coach of the Year in 1991. Unfortunately, that was not enough for the Rockets manager as Chaney was fired in February of the following year after the Rockets blew a huge 24-point lead at home to the lowly Minnesota Timberwolves. Rockets lifer and at the time assistant coach Rudy Tom-Jones would take over with the team stuck in the mud at 26-26. It didn't start great, however, for Rudy Tomjanovich, as at the time, even leading up before this, there had been some rumblings in the background where Akeem wanted an extension. The Rockets felt that they didn't need to give him an extension, especially not at what he was asking for. Eventually, it would turn into the Rockets accusing Akeem Olajuwon after taking himself out in the fourth quarter of the game, accusing him of faking an injury, and any player would not be happy with that. So it was a lot of back and forth in the media about Akeem calling the owner of the Rockets at the time, Charlie Thomas, calling him certain name, and also the Rockets front office saying that he basically was faking an injury so that he can get a better contract, or he wasn't happy with his current contract. So the Rockets were accusing him of faking that injury, and that he was able to play, but he just didn't want to play. And he came really close to playing for another team. I remember there were stories out there that teams like the Miami Heat were close to trading for him for players like Ronnie Cycli. Can you imagine the Rockets with Ronnie Cycli and not Akeem Olajuwon? It came really close. It came about as close as you can come to trading away a player. Because once you get to a point where you're in the media, especially back then, saying, I can't stand this owner, he's basically an idiot, and I think you're faking an injury, I think you're a liar. So it came that close to the Rockets moving on and trading a player who would become their best player in their entire franchise history. But luckily, as we all know, that didn't happen. Olajuwon and Thorpe and the rest of the Rockets were on the doorstep of Houston and NBA history. They just didn't know it at the time. But that 1993-94 season, the Rockets served notice early that they were not only a good team, but championship contender. With Michael Jordan's first retirement, the league was wide open. Thorpe continued to do what he had done his entire career, dominating the paint with his rebound and overall toughness, which would play out for everyone to see several months later in the season. For the 1993-94 season, Thorpe averaged 14 points and a career-high 10.6 rebounds, and of course, played in all 82 games, something that will become the theme for his entire career. The Rockets finished with the second best record in the league, and Thorpe was a massive reason for that. The next thing, of course, I want to talk about the Rockets. We got into the 93-94 playoffs. They had some early scares, of course, when playing against the Phoenix Suns, something they would also do the following season. The Rockets were on the brink of going down 0-3 in the second round. If not for Vernon Maxwell masterclass in Game 3, where he scored 31 points in the second half, the Rockets would have been down 0-3, and pretty much the series would have been over because no team has ever came back from 0-3 in NBA history. And again, another thing that if it didn't happen, another player, if he wasn't around, the Rockets wouldn't have that championship. And that's a whole nother story, another segment or episode that I would love to cover more in depth. Is just that Game 3 by Vernon Maxwell, one of the greatest performances I've seen from any player, especially any Rocket in NBA history. But of course, the Rockets will go on to win that game, win that series. They will eventually make it to the 1994 finals against the New York Knicks. And at the time, as the Rockets were preparing for the Knicks, much of the talk was about how tough the Knicks were. Of course, they were battle tested from matchup against the Chicago Bulls and the Indiana Pacers. Most people didn't think the Rockets could even compete with the Knicks' physicality. And of course, this is where Thorpe showed how valuable he was to Houston. During the NBA Finals, Thorpe battled players like Charles Oakley, Anthony Mason, even at times Patrick Ewing, and Thorpe averaged 9.3 points, over 11 rebounds, his best average for any series that year, and played almost 40 minutes a game. And you got to keep in mind, him playing 40 minutes a game was back when the NBA pretty much allowed almost anything to happen down the paint. That New York Knicks Rockets finals, I remember, was one of the most physical series I've ever seen in my life. If teams got to 90 points, that was almost like a team getting to 130 points today, because that's how physical this series was. It was elbows being thrown, people being thrown to the ground. I remember Robert Horry went up for a dunk and almost pretty much got clotheslined and thrown to the ground by half of the Knicks team. That's how physical that series was. Kind of also another side note I remember is Derek Harper going up against Kenny Smith. Of course, a lot of y'all just know Kenny Smith from his TNT days. But of course, Kenny Smith was a point guard for the Houston Rockets. He didn't really finish any games for the Rockets because most of the time it was Sam Cassell. But Derek Harper, who was a guard for the New York Knicks, pretty much completely took Kenny Smith out of the series because he would hand check Kenny Smith at the time. Of course, you could do hand checking. He would hand check Kenny Smith from the time Kenny Smith came off the bench to the time Kenny Smith came back to the other side of the court. He would not let Kenny Smith do anything. That's how physical this series was, where to the point where you couldn't even dribble up the court without somebody having their hands on you or putting their elbow in your ribs. That's how physical the series was. And without Otis Thorpe's physicality, and allowing Akeem to be able to play against Patrick Ewing one-on-one and not have to worry about doing all the dirty work in the paint, because believe me, there was a lot of dirty work in the paint. And also you got to remember, at this time, Robert Horry was a rookie. He played a big part, but nowhere near the bigger part he would play later on with the Rockets in 1995. He was still a rookie. Otis Thorpe, at the time, a lot of times was the Rockets' second best player. I don't think people realize that. Of course, Vernon Maxwell had his time where he was the second best player, but a lot of time Otis Thorpe was the Rockets' second best player. And like I said, during that series, without his physical play, especially in the paint, the Rockets wouldn't be able to beat the Knicks, because we all know it went to 7 hard-fought games. And you got to also remember, the Rockets actually trailed in that series. They had to win the last 2 games to even win the NBA Finals. They had to win, of course, that huge big Game 6 where Olajuwon had that block at the end of the game against John Starks. But again, you look at the stats and you may not think that, okay, Otis Thorpe, 11 rebounds is great, but he didn't even get to 10 points. Otis Thorpe is the type of player you got to look beyond the stats. He's the type of player you have to actually watch the game to see how huge of an impact he had. And like I said, without him, the Rockets would have never beat the New York Knicks. And of course, we all know the Rockets went on to beat the Knicks in 7 games, 90-84, and bring home Houston sports first ever championship during that 1994 season. But unfortunately, that was kind of the highlight for Otis Thorpe on the Houston Rockets, because that following year, that glow of the championship didn't last long. Even though the Rockets did start off fast, they started off winning 9 games in a row. After that, they kind of struggled a little bit. They still had a really good record up until the All-Star break. They still were 29-17. Otis Thorpe was still doing the same things he had been doing for that his entire career. But it got to the point where it seemed like Rockets management did not believe that the Rockets could take that next step with their current roster. And then they started to look around and figure, who can we trade to where we won't break up the entire core of the team? And unfortunately, that fell on Otis Thorpe, because on the other side of the world, Clyde Drexler, of course, UH alum and Houstonian, was requesting a trade from the Portland Trail Blazers, who another team at the time that had struggled. Even though they had got to the finals twice, they were never able to get over that hump. And now it seemed like management was ready to move on and was starting to rebuild. And Clyde Drexler, of course, did not like that, because he was on the back end of his career. He requested a trade. And even though he requested a trade, he never thought that he would be able to come back to the Houston Rockets after that initial disappointment back in when he came out in the draft in 1985, where the Rockets passed on him a couple of times and did not draft him, and he ended up with the Portland Trail Blazers. So on February 14th, Clyde Drexler and Tracy Murray was traded to the Houston Rockets for Otis Thorpe. And funny enough, of course, we all know it was on Valentine's Day, with the famous picture of Otis Thorpe coming into the game. The Rockets had a game that night, coming into the game with his Rockets hat on, and Tracy Murray kind of in the background, everybody kind of forgetting he was even there. And Clyde Drexler shaking Les Alexander, the owner of the Rockets at the time's hands. And of course, we all know eventually the Rockets would go on to win the championship that year, even though they struggled for most of that 1995 season, even up until the last part of the season. Now, another thing that needs to be talked about is it was a lot of players that did not like that trade. I'm not sure where Akeem fell on that. I have to imagine he was sad that Thorpe left, but at the same time, he was back playing with a guy that he played all those years with at the University of Houston, and they had all this success up, Final Four and championship games. So, but I do know players like Kenny Smith wasn't happy. Mario Elie even said it. I talked to him on a podcast some years ago. He said he wasn't happy. It wasn't necessarily anything against Clyde Drexler, but it was the fact that they played with Otis Thorpe. They won a championship with Otis Thorpe, and now you're bringing in Clyde Drexler, somebody that they really didn't know, who had never been able to get over the hump with his own team. Now you're bringing him in. So it was a lot of animosity at the time, even up all the way through the rest of the season, where they were like, who is this guy? And why is he here? And why does he think he can tell us how we're going to win when we're the NBA champions and he's not? It was all the way up until that Utah series opening round, when the Rockets had, where Clyde Drexler just went off and was able to pull the Rockets off the brink of elimination. That's when they finally realized, okay, this Clyde guy is actually pretty good. But it was a shame, because then after Otis Thorpe was traded from the Rockets to the Blazers, he kind of bounced around from team to team. His career started to wind down. He would go on to play for several teams. He finished his career with the Charlotte Hornets in 2001. Thorpe finished with his career with 17,000 points, over 10,000 rebounds. He also at one time held the record for most consecutive games played, because like I mentioned earlier, he was a true Iron Man. He had several seasons where he played every single game. And the thing about it now, somebody plays one season, they play every game. We almost throw a parade for them. Otis Thorpe had 8 out of his first 10 seasons where he played over 82 games. At one time, he had the NBA record for most consecutive games played at 542, a record that would later be broken by AC Green. But like I said, keep in mind, this was back when games were a lot more physical. To be able to play 542 consecutive games, especially at a power forward position where you're pretty much getting knocked around every single game. You're getting knocked around by players like Charles Barkley, like I mentioned, Charles Oakley, Anthony Mason, Larry Johnson. I mean, you're going against some of the most physical players in the league, and to be able to finish 34th all times in games played, that tells you how durable and how great of a player Otis Thorpe was. Otis Thorpe may never be a household name or show up in a lot of highlights from the 80s and 90s, but he is without a doubt a Rockets legend, and all Rockets fans should say thank you to OT, because without him, there wouldn't be a 1994 championship banner hanging in the Toyota Center. And that's why I wanted to make Otis Thorpe the first player in my Rockets Rewind series. I will continue to be talking about different players that may be forgotten in Rockets history throughout the summer, because, of course, we know the Rockets are in the offseason. They do have the draft lottery coming up, so that would be some news for the Rockets, even though they have a really small chance to move up from their current position, which is later in the lottery. But, of course, if they do somehow magically get to jump up higher, we will definitely be talking about it here on the Rockets Fuel podcast. We appreciate all the support. We appreciate everybody that continues to come back to the channel. Make sure you subscribe. Make sure you like, because, of course, that helps us with the YouTube algorithm. Let us know down in the comments, what are your memories about Otis Thorpe? If you were alive around the time the Rockets were winning that championship, let me know. What do you think about Otis Thorpe? Let me know some other players that I can definitely talk about. If you're a younger fan that maybe you want to know about, maybe you don't know a lot about, let me know down in the comments if somebody else you want me to talk about. And again, like I said, we appreciate support. We continue to bring you coverage throughout this entire offseason. If any breaking news happen, if anything great happens for the Rockets in the draft lottery, we will definitely be covering. As usual, we appreciate support. And make sure you check out the next episode of Rockets Fuel Podcast.